Now, in continuing to look at some of the aspects of this fundamental kind of basic training, this emotional kind of instruction we get about how to be ourselves as young people, I want to talk now about what I think is one of the hardest to grasp and one of those diabolically sinister aspects of this basic training. Now, remember that in most cases, in the overwhelming majority of cases, we human beings get this kind of emotional experience, this kind of impact upon ourselves from our caregivers, our families, usually our mothers and fathers, teachers and others we respect as well. In other words, the authority figures that we're told are there to teach us and instruct us and bring us forward to our adulthood in the early years of our lives. Now, the important part of the basic training that I want to focus on here is the subtle way in which the authority of those individuals becomes an inherent part of our experience. In other words, it's very difficult to recognize this because the way I like to express it, it kind of goes into a subtext, into a fundamental feeling we have about the very nature of life, about the very way we're supposed to live our lives. There's a kind of moral, ethical impulse in this which imposes itself on us throughout our lives. The result is that whatever the nature of the basic training, whatever the content of it, what it's going to do is it's going to impose itself on us as the right way for things to be for the rest of our lives, unless we recognize what this kind of moral impulse is working to do to us. Now, for example, I have a client who was periodically moved all over the place when she was a young child. She wasn't allowed to live more than a year or two, maybe sometime a matter of months, before she was uprooted and moved somewhere else. And whenever she did finally arrive at her home, there was never any food available. In other words, she was always worrying about what was going to be for dinner, whether it was going to be any dinner, whether she was going to be fed at all. And so she was constantly being denied any sense of the rightness of her points of view because her mother would continuously attack her and criticize her and put her down. Ultimately, they abandoned this child when she was 18 years old and they just left her out into the world, and in fact, she never saw her parents again. Now, when I made the acquaintance of this lady, she was having a hard time establishing any place for her to live. And so, in my experience of her, there was always a question of whether or not she would successfully have any home, any place to live, and able to rent a room, never mind anything bigger than that. Now, at first, it used to perplex me to have the experience that she would undermine doing anything that would effectively move toward allowing her to establish this kind of a dwelling. And it finally dawned on me that, in fact, for me to suggest to her, get this now, what the effect of this would be on the therapy, that she could do this or do that to give herself the income, to give herself the possibility of having a place to live effectively, was in fact completely rejected, was counterindicated in her very body, in her very emotional sense of herself, as we were talking about it. And it perplexed me. Why would any individual dispossess herself, make it wrong for her to have any place to live safely, you see? But then it dawned on me that there was a kind of inescapable paradox, inescapable contradiction in this individual's having a home for herself. In other words, if she successfully worked, provided the money, and gave herself a reliable place to live, a home, then she would be violating the lesson that her caregivers had taught her, that she had no home and that she had no safety and there was no place for her to live. So paradoxically, if she had a home, she would lose her mother and father. If she had a home, she would lose her home. Sounds crazy, but there it is. You see. On the other hand, if she wanted to keep her home, wanted to keep the loyalty of her parents, keep her loyalty to them. And believe me, there's a lot of that in every one of us. In other words, and that's a big part of it, the love we have, the sense of regard that we have for the authority figures, for the parents and so on, you see, then she would have no home. So she could give herself a home and lose her home, or keep her home and have no place to live, have no home. And you see, in classic therapy or in anything like that, this kind of feeling, this kind of opposition to what was being suggested, what would be good for her, would be characterized as something wrong, as a resistance or something of the kind. You see, with a capital R. You see, and therefore something wrong, something to be judged, something to be advised away from. And what that would not do, you see, would be to understand, receive, accept the actual experience that this woman had, that she was obeying the rules, obeying the law by giving herself nothing, that these were the rules that had been set up for her. And what did she know differently? You see, as a young child, she believes that what she's getting is care, and this is the way care is. There are cases where, for example, children are systematically beaten, and they interpret that as love, because there must be love in the world, they must be receiving love, so this must be it. So they're beaten and, physically abused, and they interpret it as love. Must be, you see. I don't want to begin to imagine what the subsequent life of children who have been treated that way is, but I can't believe that these unfortunate people don't end up in prison for fear of not doing anything else. But in any case, what we see, what we're dealing here, in other words, how do we escape this kind of paradoxical problem that's set up by the fundamentally negative content of what is the law of the land, what is the law of life? And my point is that we must begin with an acceptance and understanding of what the experience of that individual is. In other words, whatever the particular content was, doesn't have to be this particular one, but whatever it was, we must begin by the recognition of it, by the acceptance of it, and by allowing the individual who received it to fundamentally know, feel the presence of himself or herself as the real experience is, what the content is, you see. And so only when we let the individual, when we nurture the individual genuinely in a way to provide something that should, note the verb, have been provided from the very beginning but was not, and now we're allowing it. In other words, to simplify it, what we're saying is the individual involved in the therapy must be allowed to feel, I can be here. You see, I am allowed to be here as myself with the full content of what it is that I genuinely feel as the result of my experience. Because it's that individual who can allow himself or herself to be present, who can begin to work the process of figuring out, sussing out, discerning, imagining, feeling, computing, I note all the differences there on purpose, what it is that I as an individual must do for myself, what I will now do, realizing fully well that I will feel it's illegal or wrong, that I will regard it as a violation of all the rules of the universe, but I will go ahead and be myself because I am entitled to be that. But you see, in the process of allowing the individual to feel fully welcomed, what we're fundamentally doing is establishing an experience which implies, wait a minute, whatever the heck I've been taught or not taught, whatever the heck has been neglected or attacked, I am entitled to, I am allowed to figure out and proceed with what it is, to develop what it is that I need, what the effective living of my life would fully entail. So the importance of understanding the nature of the basic training and the nature of the rules that have been laid down could not be overemphasized. What it is should I do, what it is must I do to live my life. Wait a minute, what must I genuinely, if I want to live a life for myself, do in opposition to, in neglect of, in violation of those rules I may have been taught, which are not effective for my life. And that is not a simple process by any manner or means, but it's fundamental to its being there. I have been taught rules. Some of them may be good, some of them may not be good. What do I now individually need to learn for myself to go forward with what I need to do to live my life effectively? Oh, yes.